Hi everybody, and welcome to week 5 on the psychology of ordinary people committing extraordinary acts of evil. As usual, here are the learning objectives for the week. There's a short intro piece by Chris Browning, who provides a brief historiographical overview of perpetrator studies. In the wake of World War II and the Nuremberg trials, there developed a stereotypical image of the perpetrators as marked by some deficient, pathological, or otherwise morally deviant personality traits. For example, in some of the accounts of Holocaust survivors, there was an emphasis on the monstrosity of perpetrators, as this fantastical trope provided a means to express the otherwise inexpressibility of the Holocaust. Likewise, Theodor Adorno and his colleagues argued that a cluster of certain dispositional traits, such as adherence to conventional values, submission towards in-group authority figures, and the valuing of power and toughness, defined what they called the authoritarian personality. This study emphasized purely personal determinants of the Nazi perpetrators and discounted contemporary social influences. In the 1960s, however, there was a swing in the opposite direction towards structural accounts, with the image of the hapless bureaucrat, or the Willy Loman stereotype of the Nazis. Raoul Hilberg, for example, focused on the bureaucratic operation of the Holocaust and argued that the operators of this machinery of destruction were a remarkable cross-section of the German population. Arendt assessed Adolf Eichmann as terrifyingly and terribly normal. Yet there was a new wave of perpetrator studies in the 1990s, when there was a turn towards micro-level motivations, as demonstrated by Chris Browning's monumental study, Ordinary Men. These new perspectives have provided complex, multivariable accounts that, unlike Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, eschew any oversimplified monocausal accounts. With that said, Goldhagen's book did elicit a return to ideology and agency at the micro level of analysis. We'll come back to that in a second. But before we get further into the readings, Scholar Spotlight of the Week. Stanley Milgram was born in 1933 in the Bronx to Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. In his bar mitzvah speech soon after the war, according to his biographer, Milgram lamented the knowledge of the tragic suffering of his fellow Jews throughout war-torn Europe, and promised to do his best to bear the responsibilities which history has placed upon us all. After completing his doctorate from Harvard in 1960, he was appointed to Yale, where the next year he began his famous obedience to authority experiment, the first results of which were published in 1963, the same year that Hannah Arendt published Eichmann in Jerusalem. In order to highlight the larger significance of his work, Milgram himself emphasized the parallels with Arendt's thesis, although with that he also drew some of the same criticisms. In response, Milgram stressed that he was not trying to prove anything directly about the Holocaust, and admitted that he had sometimes gone too far in generalizing. Regardless, the Milgram experiment psychology debate over attribution theory, or the study of perceived causation. There are two general responses to this debate. As it pertains to our discussion, the dispositional approach is like the authoritarian personality from the previous slide, or perhaps Goldhagen's thesis, which is that there is some internal characteristic of a subject that makes them responsible for behaving a certain way. In contrast, Milgram, and by extension Chris Browning, exemplified the situational approach, which instead argues that people's actions and behaviors are determined by external factors in our immediate environment. But this is an either-or dilemma, as the authors note in Reading 2, one of the co-authors of which has a more recent edited volume that pertains to this research program. In any case, these contributions question the presumed distinction between dispositionalist versus situationalist accounts of attribution theory. Ultimately, social and personality psychologists have concluded that the person-situation dichotomy is an artificial one, and that trying to determine which set of variables accounts for more variance in behavior is not just difficult, but actually conceptually vacuous. Moreover, the two categories interact in complex ways. A given situation can have different effects on people as a function of the disposition they bring to those situations. Moreover, these factors are not pre-existing static entities, but are rather dynamic processes that evolve through complex interaction. So, as the authors note, there's no grand theory, no monocausal factor that accounts for what makes perpetrators tick, involved in the confluence of factors that enable ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. For example, there are difficult life conditions, situations of social stress, political crisis, economic hardship, etc. Situations where basic human needs are frustrated, where there is a sense of losing control, self-esteem, where there is a perceived need for a quick and simple solution. This is where the concept of scapegoating comes in, as an outgroup is depicted as the source of some real or imagined grievance. The authors point to a paradox of scapegoats, which are typically vulnerable and relatively powerless, but are perceived to be just the opposite. We'll come back to this paradox later. Then there are cultural factors, especially as pre-existing knowledge and belief systems can provide familiar frameworks that genocidal ideologies can graft or transplant into. There's the issue of obedience and conformity, of course, but the authors also reiterate the aforementioned point about the complex and dynamic interaction of situational and dispositional factors. Finally, they talk about lying and self-deception. In the Milgram experiments, for example, the diffusion of responsibility was an enabling factor. We saw this point as well in week 3, when James Waller talked about psychological perpetrators can be driven by a sense of idealism, a belief that what they're doing is good and righteous. We'll come back to this later when we get to Mark Levine. In any case, the authors end on a meditative note, asking whether to explain is to condone. Are we letting perpetrators off the hook? Some critics of Milgram, for example, argued that he was effectively providing an alibi for the so-called Nuremberg defense, or the superior orders doctrine. What do you think? What are the moral implications of these social psychological explanations? Moving on, reading 3 is by British historian Dan Stone, whose work demonstrates an important shift in the aforementioned post-1990s turn to the micro level of analysis. As noted earlier, since the 1960s, the dominant image of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were the so-called desk killers, like Eichmann, bureaucrats who supposedly focused on their administrative duties. If historians considered questions of ideology or intent at all, they focused on the very top level of Nazi leadership. Yet since the late 1990s and early 2000s, Holocaust historians began focusing on mid-level Nazi bureaucrats, and showed that these perpetrators were not passionless desk killers, but educated, radicalized, and devoted to the Nazi cause. This emphasis on radicalization raises an important parallel with terrorism studies. Here's the title of a supplemental reading this week by terrorist studies expert and psychologist John Horgan, who encourages us to shift our focus from attempting to identify a typical psychological profile of a terrorist, and instead look at pathways that radicalize ostensibly normal people. In other words, the concept of radicalization points to a socialization process in which individuals become committed members of extremist groups. Similarly, the perpetration of genocidal violence is a process of socialization whereby individuals acquire the norms, values, beliefs, attitudes, and expectations of an in-group. In that sense, there is a productive or even creative function to perpetration. This is an important premise of Stone's essay, which begins by noting that the social pressures argument, made by Chris Browning for example, fails to account for the excessive brutalism of the perpetrators. Not all of them were hapless bureaucrats, as depicted by Arendt and Milgram. Nor were they monsters. Rather, he argues that the perpetrators participated in so-called ecstatic communities that were formed by a heightened sense of belonging to their own in-group and that effectively legitimized their behavior, drawing from theories of the carnivalette of collective effervescence to describe how such radicalized emotions can bubble up to the surface in highly charged ideological atmospheres. Before we move on to the rest of the assigned readings, I want to take a quick detour and consider the conventionally overlooked role of gender in the perpetration of genocide. The predominance of males among genocidal killers is regularly noted, but there has been relatively little specific probing of males as perpetrators. Adam Jones, for example, notes that in Ordinary Men, Chris Browning placed the emphasis squarely on the ordinary, rather than the men per se. Combined with this is a tendency to overlook the role of female perpetrators. Now, these omissions have been corrected over the past decade or so, as there's a new research program on the role of gender in understanding what motivates and mobilizes the perpetrators. That's of Van Joden-Forgy, whose work we read in week 1, where she briefly touched upon a specific type of masculinity in genocidal projects. According to her provocative argument, this type of masculinity is actually rooted in a rejection of older, conservative forms of patriarchy. Not all men fit into patriarchal systems for many reasons, and this perceived marginalization from the conservative patriarchal order generates a profound sense of grievance, so profound that it even becomes the basis of a new identity that's geared towards resistance and protest. As we'll see momentarily, this touches upon the existential anxieties underpinning the perpetrator's paradox. At its most extreme, this creates a culture of masculinity, one that is characterized by the valorization of pure martial brutality and cold-heartedness, especially towards outsiders, and the desire, if not always the attempt, to exercise a direct control over the family lives and reproductive choices of insiders. This tracks with the late Claudia Card's analysis of, quote, being a badass, or the ethic that values toughness, meanness, cruelty, hard-heartedness, and a willing incompetence to carry out really bad deeds. Likewise, the German cultural theorist Klaus Teweleit has analyzed the cult of hardness in the post-World War I right-wing paramilitaries. There are disturbing echoes of this today, as you can see here, alternate genocides, whereby ostensibly oppressed groups, whether real or imagined, seek to gain revenge and liberation by waging genocide against their oppressors, again, whether real or imagined. We're going to come back to this theme of social constructionism, i.e. how the perpetrator's sense of reality can be intersubjectively imagined. But it's important to understand that this concept of subaltern, which comes from post-colonial studies, is defined in relation to a power structure. Specifically, the subaltern is the inverse of hegemony. Whereas hegemony defines the dominant ideology that rules a power structure, the subaltern indicates that which is excluded from the power structure. Now, whether or not the subalternity is real or imagined, it is nevertheless marked by a sense of unjust victimization, of loss, of righteous indignation, which in turn can motivate or justify the use of violence. This was the case in relatively more quote-unquote real historical examples, such as the word real in inverted commas, in order to remind us that we can't take the sense of reality for granted. In all cases, reality is socially constructed. Likewise, there are relatively more imagined examples that are nevertheless rooted in some semblance of objective reality. That is to say, there were real grievances underlying the Young Turks, or the Hutu power movements, for example. Even the punitive sanctions imposed by the Versailles Treaty after World War I posed real hardships on Germany that the Nazis were able to tap into and exploit. As identified by the author of Reading 4, Evelyn Linder, the key factor in such situations is the sentimentality of humiliation, or a sense of subjugation that damages or strips away pride, honor, and dignity. It's a sentiment that's so powerful that it may transform what is regarded as rational self-interest into redress of humiliation and protection against future humiliation. The nuclear bomb of emotions, as she calls it, may encourage extreme strategies that pursue a mystical transcendence, a quasi-religious achievement realized only after death, and pointing to the social imaginary of the perpetrators, which is an important theme for the remainder of the course. We've already ventured into this territory thus far. For example, recall our reading by Jacques Semeline in Week 3, which explored the power of imaginary constructs. He talked about how demagogues, or political leaders who prey upon the sentiments of the populace, are able to transform collective anxieties into feelings of intense fear, essentially scapegoating certain outgroups as the source of the in-group's grievances and humiliation. He also talked about how ideological belief systems function to inextricably link the imaginary and the real, providing a sort of binding agent between destructive fantasies and reality. Looking ahead to Week 7, we'll be reading a piece by historian Dirk Moses about how the imperialist political imaginary of the late 19th and early 20th century was used in the construction of the Nazis' genocidal subjectivity. He uses the sociological concept of the imaginary to identify the set of stories and symbols that operate in the background of society. We'll talk more about that particular case in Week 7, but the general idea here is that our notion of quote-unquote reality is in fact a social construction. Indeed, this is an important principle in sociology, which goes back over a century. For example, this quote is from a pair of American sociologists who said that it is not important whether or not the interpretation of reality is correct. If men, or people in the generic sense, define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. The implication is that in order to understand the etiology of genocide, we must venture into the intersubjectively imagined worldview of the perpetrators. And this leads us to our final reading of the week, by Mark Levine, who picks up on this theme by arguing that the targeted group of genocide is socially constructed by the perpetrators. And some groups may be objectively real. The Jews, for example, were obviously very real, but some groups are not, like the kulaks in the Soviet Union. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's how the perpetrators imagine the groups. Levine is delving into what is called collective psychopathology. We'll explore this concept a bit further in a couple of weeks, but a good example of this phenomenon is what Daniel Jenna Goldhagen calls the hallucinatory anti-Semitism of the Nazis, which was so at odds with reality. Likewise, Levine gives considerable attention to the infamous anti-Semitic track, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which exemplifies the phantasmic nature of the genocidal subjectivity, which is underpinned by the idea that the threat of an outgroup is demonic, even supernatural, or at least not readily seen by the naked eye. There's also an eschatological sense of an impending doomsday, an existential crisis that calls for redemption. Thus we arrive at the perpetrator-victim paradox, which is marked by an imaginary role reversal, whereby the perpetrators see themselves as the real victims, whereas their actual victims are instead demonized and cast into the role of the perpetrators. This is a paradox. On the one hand, the actual victims of genocide almost always tend to be defenseless. On the other hand, the perpetrators see the victims as existential threats. How is this so? And does this argument risk blaming the victims? That's it. As usual, we have our discussion forum assignments, and you should be staying on top of your annotated bibliography assignment. As well, you should be moving forward on your historiographical essay. Reach out to me if you want to discuss. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you